Hey teachers, it is October and we are working through the story of the Israelites in class. And I was talking to a couple people last night and realizing that we are really getting into some stories that a lot of people haven't heard in children's ministry before, or maybe even at all. It's really easy to know the stories of Genesis and Exodus, and then after we get out of that, it gets a little bit muddled and confusing. And so I thought I would just kind of walk us through these stories a little bit to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of what's happening with the Israelites, and maybe give a little bit of extra background so that it all kind of fits together and makes sense. If I have to stop in the middle of this, I have to go to first service. Oh, there goes Rose. Sorry, Rose. I might have to go to first service and then come back and talk about the rest. So first of all, let's talk about where the Israelites have been so far. So we start way back in Genesis with creation and Adam and Eve. And they lived in this perfect garden and decided to sin. So they were kicked out of the garden. Their relationship with God was broken. They were no longer able to walk with him in the garden and talk with him in person. But there was a distance between them and God. And so that goes on for a while. Hey, David, what you got? Anyway, where was I? Oh, so Adam and Eve were removed from the garden, and then we get to Cain and Abel. We see that sin is continuing to take over the world and affect everyone and everything in it. And then we get to the flood and Noah, where the world has become completely corrupt, and God decides to kind of start over and wipe everything out. But Noah and his family, his sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, are saved through the ark, and the covenant is made with them through the rainbow that God will never flood the earth again. There's never going to be this catastrophic event. And then we get to Abraham, and Abraham is super important for us with the Israelites because he's the father of Israel. God promises him that he'll be a great nation, that all the people on the earth will be blessed through him, and that he will, his children's children, his descendants, will inherit the land of Canaan, where he was taken from his father's land into Canaan. So then we get to Isaac, and the sacrifice there that wasn't really sacrificed because God provided a way out. Then Isaac has Jacob and Esau, where we really see a split in the family. We have Esau, who becomes the Edomites, and Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel and becomes the father of Israel. He has the 12 sons. One of them is Joseph. The 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph gets shipped off to Egypt, and eventually, through all of his trials, saves the land of Egypt, and with all the famine and everything, his family comes and he saves them. Then they move to Egypt, and that ends the book of Genesis. Into the book of Exodus, we find out that the Israelites have continued to grow and reproduce there, but they have become a threat to Egypt. So Egypt enslaves them. They're there for about 400 years. And finally we get to Moses. So with Moses, all the baby boys were being killed because they were still continuing to have so many kids. Moses' family keeps him for about 3 months, and then puts him in the Nile to try to save him. He's found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace, but he always knows that he's a Hebrew because he was able to go back with his family for several years to be raised and weaned until he was ready to go to the palace. So he sees the Israelite being abused and kills the Egyptian, runs off to the desert, and stays there for a little while until he encounters the burning bush, where he's called by God to go and save the Israelites, which he doesn't really want to, but finally God convinces him and sends him Aaron to be his spokesman. So even though God's talking through Moses, Moses is communicating through Aaron to Pharaoh. You have the plagues, the Passover. Eventually the Israelites are let go. They cross the Red Sea, and all the Egyptians die chasing them. And we get to Mount Sinai, where they get the law, the Ten Commandments, and all the rest of the law. They learn about the tabernacle. We really get a good picture of God's holiness there, which is going to be a really, really important theme for us, especially going into the month of October. We see that God is not someone who can just be approached by sinful people, that there's a lot of ceremony around it because it's so important that the people know that there's distance there because of their sin. So finally, we get up to the land of Canaan. The Israelites have made it. Moses has been their kind of guide and gotten them through. They've gotten the manna in the wilderness. They've gotten the quail. They've been following the cloud by day and the fire by night so that they know where they're going, because they're all coming out of Egypt and they don't know where they're going. And so all of this leads us to where we are right now in October. I think the younger class has already sent spies to Canaan, but that's where we are. So they get up to the promised land, and they have been told by God that it's a land full of milk and honey, and that there's all of this provision, and this is the land that they were promised, and that they need to go in and conquer it and take over and kind of be the embodiment of Abraham's promise and finally take that land. So God sends them to, he tells them to send spies. They send 12 spies, one from each tribe, to investigate the land and see if it really is what God said it was. So that's where we start. With these lessons. So that's our background. Our overall theme for this month is going to be seeing the consequences of rejecting God and his plan. There's a whole lot of that all through this month. All the lessons are really going to center around God tells them to do one thing, God gives them instructions, and they decide not to, and there are consequences that go with that. And so there's this real balancing act, especially in kind of the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, where we are looking at the relationship that God wants to have with his people. He wants them to be with him. He wants to dwell with them. And we see that in the tabernacle, but we also have to recognize his holiness and the fact that we can't really be that close to him because of our sinful state. And the same thing with justice and grace. Like, God is just and he is gracious, and there is a balance there. And so there are consequences to when we decide to sin and whenever we do wrong things. But God is so gracious, and he continues to forgive and bring people back to him and call them back into relationship with him, even though they sin and continue to kind of push him away. And so that's our themes for this month. So the Israelites go into Canaan and find exactly what God said that they would find. They find the land flowing with milk and honey. They find these grapes that they have to like carry on poles between two guys because it's just the huge grapevine is so big that they can't even carry one by themselves. Exactly what God had promised, but there were also really big, scary people in the land. There were fortified cities like Jericho that had huge walls around them. They had gigantic people, which we see remnants of with Goliath later on. Like, it's big, scary guys. And so the spies come back, and I think we all kind of are familiar with this story. They say, yeah, it's exactly what God said it was, but also it's scary and we shouldn't go because we can't defeat them. We're just this little nation. We're this nomadic people. They have these big fortified cities. There's no way we can defeat them. And so we get Caleb and Joshua are the two that came back and said, yeah, you know, it's scary, but we trust God. We think that God is going to do the things that he said he would do. Moses and Aaron are with them and say, yeah, let's trust God. Let's go do this. And the people just say, no, that's not it. We don't want to do that. And so they reject God's plan and say, we're not going to do that. Important note, Joshua has been showing up throughout the book of Exodus. I don't know if you've seen it, if you've kind of been studying along with us, but Joshua has been Moses' right-hand man throughout everything. So he was there whenever Moses went up the mountain to receive the law. He didn't go up the very last time, but he went up the mountain. He met God. He was there in the tent of meeting before the tabernacle was built, and was able to kind of really be Moses's like kind of apprentice, as it were, which obviously Moses or Joseph is going to take over after Moses dies. And so it's really important to see how much Joshua has been involved through this whole thing. He's been around. And so he's one of the guys that came back and said it was good. Caleb is the other one. But the people reject Caleb and Joshua and Moses and Aaron and say, no, we're not going to do it. It's too scary. And yeah, then we really get to see God's justice at work, because it makes him really mad. Like, he's shown them all of these amazing things. They've come out of Exodus, and they've been provided for in the desert on this way here. Clearly, God has the ability to do whatever he wants, but the people still reject his plan and are too afraid. And so they get the consequence of having to wander in the desert for 40 years. I like to point out to the kids especially how incredibly frustrating that would be as a kid. Seeing your parents like go all this way, you've come out of Egypt, and then their decisions, and you're like, we don't get to go in to the land that we've been traveling for 2 years to get to, because you didn't want to follow God, and now we're going to have to go in, and we're going to have to conquer all these people after you're dead. And so it's just kind of an interesting perspective to kind of look at it from the kids' perspective. But anyway, eventually, whenever they learn the consequences of not wanting to go into the land, they say, wait, we'll do it. We'll go in. It's okay. And they try to go, a lot of them try to go and like fight one of the nations in Canaan, and of course it ends up in disaster because God's not with them, and a bunch of them die, and they realize, yeah, we're just going to have to face these consequences. And I think that that's an important thing to demonstrate to kids too, because they, at least I know my kids can relate to that. Like, they decided to disobey and not do the things that they're supposed to do, and once they hear what the consequences are, they're like, wait, we'll go do it. We'll hit, and it's like, it's too late. You got the consequences now. And so yeah, that's kind of where the Israelites are. So that's most of week 1. Week 2, we see some wandering around in the desert. The little kids are going to talk about following the cloud and the fire, and moving, and I think a couple of classes actually do that, move around from place to place in the middle of their lessons. And I think that's really important to help them kind of know, like, this wasn't just a camping trip where you get to go and set up a tent and then you're just going to stay there for 40 years. They had to pack up and move every time the cloud moved up off the tabernacle. It didn't matter what time of day it was. It didn't matter how long they'd been there. They had to be ready to get up and move. It's important to see that the tabernacle was built to be moved around. God clearly knew what was going to happen with the Israelites, and made provisions for that. But this was 40 years of really kind of moving from place to place, and it's exhausting and tiring, and they've got to deal with a lot of nations around them. And so a couple of classes, I think the 2 younger classes are both going to be talking about moving around and having to follow God, and how annoying that probably was. We're also going to be looking at some rebellions in the wilderness. Obviously, when people are frustrated and tired and annoyed at themselves, emotions are going to run high. And so we see Korah's rebellion. I don't remember which class. Maybe the oldest class is doing Korah's rebellion. Or the priests kind of say, you know, God chose us too, and it's not just Moses and Aaron being in charge, and we need to be in charge too. And so kind of talking about how God's call on certain people and his desire for some people to be leaders is not a commentary on the value of anybody else, right? Somebody's got to be the leader, and God chose Moses and Aaron. And Korah and his followers kind of saw that as a slight on them to say that they weren't as important or as valuable to God. But that's not the case. But because they decided to rise up and reject God's plan once again, for how he wanted the Israelites to be led, there were serious consequences, and all of his people got killed. And you never want to be in a situation where you're in the group that says, hey, everybody back away from this guy because he's about to be smited by God. So there's that. We talk a little bit, I think, about the fact that their families also had to face the consequences of their actions. These families were obviously kind of following the leadership of the men in their lives, and not kind of distancing themselves from the rejection of God. But also there's an important thing about whenever we have a leader over us, they are responsible for us, and the consequences of their decisions can trickle down to the people who they are leading. And so finding a leader who is worthy of following is important. Throughout all this, so we see some nations who are trying to kind of test Israel's strength a little bit as they're wandering around. They're going to have to fight some battles, because some of the nations see them and they're like, well, there's this little nation running around. They've got all of this gold from Egypt, and so we're going to go try to take them on. But God protects the Israelites, and the Israelites start to get a really serious reputation in the land for being people that have a special protection over them. So the rumors from Egypt will have certainly reached the ears of the Canaanites, and then more and more as the people are attacked by neighboring nations, word gets around that the Israelites are a special group that has more strength behind them than is apparent. So then we move into Moses striking the rock, which I think is a often misunderstood story, as we kind of teach it to kids. So at least when I was growing up, I kind of was under the impression that, God had told Moses to strike the rock before, and now he told him to speak to it instead, and Moses just made a mistake, and he kind of misunderstood, and he struck the right rock instead of talking to it. And that's really not what happened here with Moses. Moses had been through these rebellions. His sister had just died, Miriam, and so again, he's got these people who are just nagging at him all the time. Everybody's always unhappy with poor Moses, and it gets old, right? And so the people come to him and they're like, you've led us out into the wilderness and it's all your fault, and why can't we just have the milk and honey that you promised us, and we want to go back to Egypt and all this stuff. And Moses is like, I led you out of Egypt. I told you to go into the land of Canaan. What are you doing? Like, if you just listened to me, we would already be in Canaan and we would be living the great life, but instead we're out here in the wilderness. And so Moses is really frustrated, right? But all the people are blaming him for all their problems, which is one of the reasons that maybe you don't want to be a leader like Korah did. But that's what Moses is dealing with. And so in all of this, God tells him, well, you're going to go and you're going to speak to the rock and you're going to give the people water like they need, like they're asking for. And so Moses comes up and he doesn't just strike the rock. He says, I have to do this. I have to provide for you. Y'all are always nagging at me, and I have got to come up here and give you water. And he strikes the rock. And so it's not about really, I think, on the heart level, it's not about him striking the rock, right? It's about him saying, I'm the one that's doing all this provision for you. I'm the one that's taking care of you. He's taking on he's taking responsibility or taking credit for the things that God has done for the people of Israel. And I think that that's his really big, huge mistake that he makes in striking the rock in his anger and frustration. And so I think that that's where he really faces a major consequence. And of course, we have to recognize that Moses was the one who got to see God. He was the one who got to approach God, and so there is a higher standard there for Moses. And so whenever he goes and makes this huge mistake, there's a huge consequence. And so while it may seem like the consequence doesn't fit the crime, there's a lot more there than kind of meets the eye. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out with that one. So there's also in this section the story of Balaam, which the first through third graders get to learn about, which I just love the story of Balaam. It's so funny. And such just a surprising story right there in the middle of all of this chaos. So if you're not familiar with the story of Balaam, Balaam was kind of a sorcerer of types. He was known as a prophet. He could curse people, and those curses would come true. He clearly worshipped a lot of gods, but the God of Israel was one of them. And how that works, I'm not exactly sure. We see other places where gods worshipped. So we see Melchizedek there meeting with Abraham, who, clearly God is there and present and working. And so whether or not that's kind of stories that were being passed down from Esau to his family, or just rumors of people who had heard what was going on in Egypt and with the Israelites, and they wanted to kind of dabble in whatever their God was. So Balaam, among all of the other gods that he was worshiping, the God of Israel was also there too. And so he recognizes God of Israel as a God, but not the God. So Balaam's there. He's got these powers. And one of the leader of Moab, I believe it is, comes to him and says, hey, I want you to curse the Israelites. They're coming up close to my land, and I don't like it, and they're scary because they've got this protection of God over them, and so I just want you to curse them. Say that they're not going to be able to be successful in our country. And so Balaam goes and he asks God, and God's like, no, you can't do that. These are my people. You can't curse them. And so Balaam's like, sorry, I can't do it. And the guy's like, hey, I will, Balak, something like that. I don't remember his name. Anyway, he says, I will give you a lot of money, and I'm going to give you all this power. And so you're going to benefit greatly if you curse these people. And Balaam is a opportunist, and he wants to get the money, and so he goes back to God and says, hey God, you sure? Can I please curse them? And God's like, no, you still can't curse them. That's not how it's going to work. And so they go back and forth for a little while, and eventually God actually says, yeah, okay, go curse them, whatever. And I think that that's an interesting thing for God to do. Balak is the leader. Because God clearly didn't want Balaam to curse the Israelites, and we'll see later that there are consequences for Balaam. So why say yes? Well, I think that God knew that that is exactly what Balaam wanted to do, and he was going to continue to ask and continue to kind of make allowances and move closer and closer to the sin that was enticing him. And so eventually God just said, all right, well, go do it, and we're going to see what happens. And we can see what happens. So Balaam's on his way to Moab to meet Balak and curse the Israelites, and his donkey stops, and he starts like beating on the donkey, and the donkey still won't go, and eventually the donkey starts talking to Balak, and it's like, hey, why are you beating me up? I'm just trying to save you from the angel with the flaming sword in the middle of the road. And like, the craziest thing is Balaam's just like starts talking to his donkey like it's totally normal for your donkey to start talking to you. That's what happens. Balaam eventually sees the angel in the road and realizes that the donkey has saved him from death from the angel. And so, but he still goes to Moab eventually and tries to curse the Israelites, and like can't get it out of his mouth. Like all he can get out of his mouth is blessing. And so even though he's trying to curse the Israelites, even though Balak is paying him to curse the Israelites, the only thing he can do is bless the Israelites, because God's purposes will be fulfilled, and he will have what he has said he will have. And so that's the story of Balaam. Eventually, Balaam is going to get killed in battle with the Israelites because of what he tried to do to the Israelites. Okay, that's most of week 2 and 3. In week 4, we're getting closer to the promised land. So the youngest kids are still in the camp. They're learning about the snakes that come, and that's a really interesting story that we don't really hear a bunch of, but I think it's important, and especially because Jesus refers to it in his life. And so it's in, I'm going to pull it up here real quick. It's in Numbers 21. And the people had been complaining about the food and calling it miserable food, the manna, and complaining about being in the wilderness, and they're just complaining, which is what they're so good at. And so God sends venomous snakes into the camp, and they're biting everybody and killing everybody. And the people, of course, cry out for salvation, which is what they do. And so God has Moses put up this bronze snake in the middle of the camp, and the people are supposed to go to it and look to it, and then be healed, which seems nuts because it looks like idolatry, right? It looks like if you're going to like bow down before this snake and it's supposed to heal you, that that would be kind of like worshiping another god, right? But it's what God told them to do. It was an act of faith for them to go and look at the snake, because obviously looking at a bronze snake is not a reasonable way to heal yourself from a snake bite, but they're making an action that shows their faith in God. And Jesus refers to this in John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. He says it's a foreshadowing of his death, and how he had to be lifted up, and people have to look to him in his death to have salvation from the poison inside of us. And so I think it's a valuable story, and I think it's one that we can at least touch on with the little kids, and there's lots of fun games that we can play with it anyway, so that's fun. And so they're going to study that one. The middle kids are going to study the Transjordan tribes, which are another one that you don't hear a lot about, but it's got some really interesting implications for the future. And so what happened was the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh kind of said, hey, we're over here on the other side of the Jordan. So if you look at a map, I don't know if I have one. That's probably not right. Anyway, if you're thinking about Israel, you've got like Israel here, and the Jordan River runs here, and then there's this land over here on this side of the Jordan. And so Canaan, Israel is over here, and the Israelites are on the other side. They haven't quite made it in across the Jordan and into the land of Canaan proper. But the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh say, hey, this is good enough, guys. We're happy here. We have already kind of settled in. Our families are happy here. We want to just stay here, and we don't want to go into Canaan. And of course, this causes a big rift, because the people are like, you're just scared to go in and fight all the battles and take over the land. And they're like, no, we really just want to stay here. And so we will go and we will fight with you in Canaan until you've conquered the land and you're happy. And then we'll go back and be with our families. We'll leave our wives and children here across the Jordan. The men will fight, and then we'll come back to our families whenever the fighting's done. So they decide that that's a good way to do it, and those tribes end up settling on the other side of the Jordan River. So we call those the Transjordan tribes, and that's going to cause some trouble later on, but for the immediate, it's just kind of saying, like, God's promised us this great land, and we're kind of happy where we are, right? Like, we could go in and we could have this better promise that God has made to us, but we'll take what we've got right in front of us right now. And so it's kind of a not trusting in God that his promises are as good as he says that they are. Um, and so that's the Transjordan tribes. And then finally, we have the book of Deuteronomy, which the older kids are going to talk about, but really it's kind of the overall story of what's happened so far. So this is Moses at the very end of his life. He knows he's not going into the land of Canaan. He knows he's about to die, and he wants to tell the new generation about what God has commanded to them, what God wants from them. And so if you remember, all of the parents have died. All the people who came out of Egypt as adults died in the wilderness, so that the new generation could go into the land of Canaan. And so Moses is taking this new generation and saying, look, you were just children whenever all this happened. I'm going to remind you of exactly what God said. And so Deuteronomy literally means the second law. It's the second time that Moses presented the law to the people. And so he's going to over and over and over again say, you've got to listen to God. You've got to do what God says. You cannot worship the gods of this land that you're going into. You you will have to kill all the people that God says to kill, because if you don't, then your children are going to intermarry and they're going to worship other gods and they're going to follow the ways of the people of this land. And so it's just Moses' entreating of, like, look at what God's done. He's brought us out of Egypt. He did all of these miracles. He provided for us in the wilderness. He goes back through all the story and says, this is a God you can trust. And if you trust him, he's going to bless you. You're going to have amazing things happen in this land. But if you do not follow him, there are going to be major consequences. And so that's kind of the book of Deuteronomy in a nutshell. It's just Moses, again, giving that entreaty to the people to follow God and to trust him and to do the things that he says. And then, of course, later on we will find out that they did not do that, and they're going to worship other gods and not kill the people that they're supposed to kill, and there's all kinds of stuff that goes into that. And so we'll talk a little more next month about the idea of going in and killing everybody in the land and why would God ask us to do that. And so we'll get into that kind of stuff later. But that's the basic idea of what's going on this month in the lesson. So I hope that that gives a little more clarity and a little more kind of the overall picture of what's going on with the Israelites as they wander in the wilderness and eventually head up to get ready to conquer Canaan. And so, yeah, if you have any questions about this stuff, let me know, and I'm happy to kind of walk you through it and talk about it. But hopefully that gives a little bit more insight into what you're teaching. Okay. Have a great month with your kiddos.